I think it's a little bit of a hard act to come at the very end of the day, but I'm very pleased both to introduce myself. I'm Dr. Karen Mundy, a professor at the University of Toronto. I've spent much of my career moving between policy and academic roles, most recently as the Chief Technical Officer at the Global Partnership for Education. And I think one of the fascinating areas of study that has come out here today really is about what is it, how do governments themselves make hard choices and drive those choices down to the school or to the district level. Today we have as our guest, our honored guest, Dr. Kwabena Tandoh, who is the Acting Deputy Director General of the Ghana Education Service, and he's responsible for the area of quality and access, so couldn't be more perfect given the themes of the research that we've heard from today. He has a PhD in higher education leadership and has held many distinguished roles and has worked for the World Bank, among others. Now, I was told in preparing to introduce him that he is also the youngest person to have held a position of this rank in the Ministry of Education. He is full of fresh ideas, some of which I hope he will share with us both in his presentation and, of course, in a short question and answer armchair session that I'll have with him. And then we'll spend the last 30 minutes opening it up to you. So please, it's that time of day when I'm counting on you for some provocative questions to keep us all awake and attentive. All right, so Dr. Tandoh.
It's, like you said, it's a difficult act at the end of the day. So I'm here to bid you good night. For some of us who are coming from either Africa or Asia, it's bedtime. It's almost 10 p.m. And my daughter sent me a message about 15 minutes ago and said, we need to talk before I sleep. And I'm telling her that we're going to be talking in another hour and a half when I'm done. And she's trying to figure out the whole time difference thing. So I'm going to try to make it as lively as possible to tell you a bit about what we are doing in Ghana. And then hopefully we'll have a conversation after. But we are here to talk about, the hard choices that the government of Ghana through the Minister of Education have to make, especially around what we need to do with all of our reforms in education. And to just give you some context in terms of Ghana, as of 2017, we have almost 29 million people in the country. And the total land area is about 238,000 square kilometers. For some of you that are from the United States, it's about the size of the state of Oregon. So it gives you some perspective. GDP 2017 was just a little over 47 billion US dollars. And then per capita income in terms of GDP for the same 2017 was just under 1,700 US dollars. We have a life expectancy of a little over 62 years, so I'm not there yet. I still have a little bit of time before, I'm called on. But as of 2015, about 40%, so 4 in 10 people in Ghana as of 2015 were under the age of 14. So we have such a young population. And so reforms in education are very critical to ensuring that our national development, especially moving forward, is going to be very good. 55% of the population are also between the ages of 15 and 64. So we have a very active workforce as well. And just under 1.9% are over the age of 65. But what is interesting is that our president is over the age of 65, so the 1.4% are very critical to what we do as a country. The number of school-age children, that's between the ages of 4 and 18, is projected to grow by just over 2% per year between now and the year 2024. By 2025, it's projected to be about 1.9%. And then 2030 is projected to be about 1.7%. And this is really contextualized in terms of the African context, because we know that the population of Africa is also very young. And so what you do in education is going to be very critical in terms of how development happens. So What are some of our challenges, especially in the education area? And we have a long list. We've tried to actually summarize it in about 12 major areas in terms of challenges. But we see that we have inadequate access to pre-tertiary education, both by geographic location as well as by wealth. And so you see that people who are in the rural areas have less access, and then people with less financial resources also have access issues. Then, of course, we have, just like most developing nations, we have infrastructure challenges. So you have more children than you have facilities available, and then even the quality of the infrastructure, they are major challenges for us. We have poor learning outcomes, and so my role is very important in terms of quality, the quality aspect of my role. But we have poor learning outcomes. In the Education for All goals, Ghana was able to meet all of them except for goal number 6, which looks at quality learning outcomes. So learning outcomes are one of our major challenges. And then, of course, we had a curriculum that was outdated. It had not been revised in over a decade, and our curriculums were not really designed for the 21st century and what is expected. We also have poor relevance in terms of the teacher education curriculum, and so what is happening in pre-service before we hire teachers into the Ghana Education Service. We also happen to be the largest employer in Ghana. We employ over 338,000 people, and so we bring in a lot of people into the education space. And the curriculum to prepare the teachers, there was really no relevance to what was happening. And then the teachers themselves, in terms of professionalization of the teaching space, as well as our HR policy within the Ghana Education Service. We have a saying in Ghana that if we get it right in the GES, we get the HR right in Ghana, because we have such a large number. Moving on, we have this is something everybody has been talking about. We have serious challenges in terms of accountability, especially for performance, and inadequate supervision and monitoring. It's one of our major challenges. Outdated legal and institutional and regulatory framework. And so the legislation that is really governing how education is running in the country needed some updating. We have a lack of integration, especially when it comes to students with special needs, and integrating them into mainstream schools. We have a good special education division, but integration is one of our biggest challenges in mainstreaming of students with special needs. And then there is an absence of opportunity for people who have either dropped out of school or are not in school, and how do you mop them up and bring them into the formal education space and learning opportunities for them. Then, of course, the fourth industrial revolution, we have a major digital skills gap. So, and this is really just a small section of the challenges that we have. But based on all of this, how do you prioritize? What are some of the things that are important to help us as a country begin to propel towards what we expect our citizenry and our people to be in the next 10, 15, 20 years? How do we prioritize in education when we have 40% of our people under the age of 14? So we looked at 5 key levers in terms of quality of education, and I'll go through all of them very quickly. So these are the priorities, and as I go through, I'll explain why they were pivotal and how it fits in terms of the jigsaw puzzle. We are interested in looking at high-quality teachers, and then if you look at high-quality teachers, how do you modernize your curriculum, and not just your curriculum, but your assessment structure to ensure that the curriculum that you have put in place, you are assessing your students to make sure that they are meeting the standards that you've set for them. And then the teaching resources, that they are high quality, but also that the teaching resources make sense in terms of the context to our environment. And then effective school leadership. We've had a lot of presentations around school leadership and effective school leadership, and we believe that those things are also very important. And then in general, need as an education space to have high aspirations and standards for ourselves. What does this all mean? In terms of high quality teachers, these are some of the reforms that we are putting in place. One is that we've been able to have a national teacher education curriculum framework. And so the outdated pre-service curriculum, we've been able to put together a framework that makes sense so that the teachers that are going to be coming into the Ghana Education Service and into the education space in general, there is a major reorganization of the curriculum. One of the big things that is exciting about it is that we now have a national teacher standards, and that national teacher standard to ensure that we have a licensing system. And so not just anybody can wake up and say, I want to become a teacher, but they go through a certain set of standards to become a teacher. There is a licensing structure that requires renewal of licenses after a certain number of years of practice. And then the most exciting part of it is that before now, we had teachers coming up with higher national diplomas, so they were not degree holders. And the law has been changed and the structure has been changed to ensure that every single teacher moving forward that we hire in the Ghana Education Service, or in any school for that matter in the country, whether private or public, has at least a bachelor's degree in education as an initial step in entering the education space. And then the conversion, in doing that, the conversion of our colleges of education into university colleges of education and affiliating them with the public universities in the country. And here we had 46 colleges of education, and all of them have now been affiliated to public universities, which means even the qualifications of the lecturers who are going to be teaching in the university colleges have to be upgraded. So that's what we mean. In terms of teacher professionalization and continuous professional development, I think I already mentioned the licensure. And in terms of the licensure, we just started, and we've done 2 exams so far. One in September of last year, where about 76% of the people who sat for the licensure exam passed. The second one was done in March, and the March of this year. And then what is going to happen is that moving forward, there's going to be 2 opportunities to do licensure exams each year. And then an assessment framework has been developed, to guide the registration and licensure of teachers, so that there is some, it makes sense, and there is some good way of doing that. And then in terms of the teacher professionalization, what we are doing is that the Ghana Education Service, we have adopted the PTPDM. If you can say that without looking on the board, I'll give you $5, but it's a mouthful, which is pre-tertiary teacher professional development and management policy to guide how professional development is done, or continuous professional development is done. Still under this, all of this will culminate, or will look at the 9 UNESCO benchmarks in terms of the policy that we come up with. So I don't need to spend a lot of time on here. And of course, we are working with the Teacher Task Force to develop a comprehensive teacher policy, in Ghana. Now, once you have your quality teachers, you need to have a quality curriculum that they need to be able to deliver. And so what has happened in Ghana is that for the first time, the cabinet has actually approved a curriculum framework, under which all curriculum review will work within. So that curriculum framework for pre-tertiary education has been approved by cabinet, and there has already been the KG to primary 6 curriculum that has been developed by the National Council for Curriculum and Assessment. That curriculum is going to be implemented beginning in September, and I will discuss a bit more with you in terms of the process that we put in place to ensure that the curriculum will be delivered in September. It's a Herculean task. We have to train 152,000 teachers on the curriculum, and it has, the curriculum is emphasizing mathematics and science as well as literacy, and then looking at how do we get students that can think critically and become problem solvers. Now, the goals of the curriculum is that we are shifting more from an objectives-based curriculum, where students were kind of prepared to go through this male and receive or write an exam at the end of the educational career, to a standards-based curriculum where there are a certain set of standards that students need to be able to achieve in order to move on to the next stage. And we are focusing on what we are calling the 4 R's in terms of reading, writing, arithmetic, and creativity, and then using it as the foundational skills for lifelong learning for our students. And then what we are doing is that we are reintroducing national history, or the study of history, as a standalone, as well as religious and moral education as a standalone, especially in our religious schools, as well as the introduction of a foreign language as compulsory up to junior high school, at least French and Arabic. And then the all-important introduction of ICT as a teaching and learning aid to ensure effective integration in our schools. And then introduction of technology to help in terms of mathematics. The revised curriculum we have officially launched the revised curriculum. And so I will tell you a bit about what we are doing in terms of the implementation strategy. We have to train 152,000 people. How do you do it? We started with what we call the national simulation. So we took the entire curriculum and we simulated it with only 36 people. So we went through a simulation with 36 people, and then we corrected whatever challenges that we had after the simulation. Then we moved from 36 people to 186 national or master trainers. And they went through a 1-week training. Then they themselves went back, added their own observations and things to it, then went back for another 1-week training where we also looked at assessment for learning as integration into the curriculum. And then we are at our third stage, which is from 36 to 186 people, and now we are training 3,900 people. And that's what we are calling our national and district level trainers. In Ghana, we have 260 districts, and each of the districts have what we call the DTST, or the District Teacher Support Teams. And so the DTST members, who are 15, are all being trained, and then they will go back into their districts to then do cluster level trainings. And our cluster level trainings are going to be 996 clusters with 150 teachers in each of the clusters. But you cannot really get somebody to change the way they teach in just 5 days or 8 days or 10 days. And so that is going to culminate into our continuous professional development, or what we are calling professional learning communities. And so we are going to be developing professional learning communities, not even at the cluster level, but at the circuit level. And we have over 1,750 circuits. So in each of those circuits, we're establishing professional learning communities that will be supported by the national and district level trainers. And then what we are also doing is that beginning in September, we are actually changing our academic calendar for the first time in our history. We are going to have professional development days woven into our calendar, where every quarter kids are not going to be in school, but the teachers and professionals are going to be in school, and they're going to take time to really go through some of the areas that they are facing challenges in. In terms of the new curriculum too, we have been able to develop some structured lessons, worksheets, yearly reviews or yearly overviews, sample schemes of work, and guided lessons for our teachers to use. And I believe I already talked about this. I'm speaking faster than my slides. But then after the completion of the curriculum revision, what we are now doing is establishing an assessment framework as well. And this is still being done by the National Council for Curriculum and Assessment, and looking at a comprehensive assessment framework. For the first time in the country, what we are also doing is that we are assessing students at varying intervals. In Ghana, before now, we used to assess students after 11 years of education for the first time. And so if there were challenges or there were at-risk kids, it was very difficult to identify those at-risk kids, especially if the school level was not designing interventions. But what we are doing now is that now in primary 2, which is after 4 years of education, 2 years of KG and 2 years of primary, we do our first national assessment for every single child. And then in primary 4, we repeat that assessment after interventions in primary 3. Then we repeat that assessment again in primary 6 after another 2 years of intervention, repeat it again in junior high school 2 before they sit for their first basic education certificate examination. So we've provided 4 opportunities before their first West Africa exam or their first big exam to be assessed nationally, provide intervention in terms of learning outcomes before they sit for their first BEC or basic education certificate examination. Now, high quality teaching resources, what do we mean by that is that because we are now bringing out a new curriculum, we are also looking at the provision of quality textbooks and supplementary readers, mathematics sets, and ICT facilities. In terms of the ICT facilities, I guess I'll talk a little bit again about that again. I was going to speak faster than my slides. We are also working with our partners. Of course, we are working with USAID Learning. There is a learning project which, when you were discussing the project in Kenya, I kept whispering to Bernard that it's very aligned to what learning is doing in Ghana in terms of phonics or literacy, and which is the adoption of a phonics-based approach to teaching the English language. And we are working with Jolly Phonics and USAID to scale at the national level in terms of our curriculum at KG and lower primary for literacy. We're also collaborating with Matific and then Wiz Education, especially, and then Big Win Philanthropy in our approaches to numeracy education and the adoption of technology as a way to improve numeracy in our students. And then back to technology, we are all doing what we also call the BSTEM, or Basic Science, Technology, Engineering, and Mathematics, and we are introducing this to all of our basic schools. What does this mean? The government has actually approved the delivery of STEM equipment to all 38,750 of our basic schools disaggregated. So every KG school, every primary school, and every junior high school will receive STEM technology, STEM equipment for students to be able to be introduced to science, technology, engineering, and mathematics at a very early age. And we've contracted iTech to do that. We are also constructing across the country 20 STEM facilities, where each of the facilities can host up to 120 students at a time for students to be engaged in science, technology, and engineering at a very early age. Now, once you have good curriculum, you need to have good leadership, because if you just, there was a presentation on control or trust, right? But we believe that good school leadership is also important. What are we doing in that area? As Ghana Education Service, we are reorienting ourselves to become a learning organization. For a long time, we had been a human resource management organization, moving teachers from one space to another. And so we want to reorganize ourselves as a learning organization. And so what we have done in Ghana Education Service is reorganize the way our institutional structure works. And we now have the establishment of a management services division, which is going to focus on HR, financial and HR processes and HR practices. But then we also have the strong quality and access area that's looking at teaching and learning. And one of the things, even though it's not on our slide, is that we have now established a division within the Ghana Education Service that is looking at research and assessment. And so as part of our learning organization, how do we ensure that internally we are gathering our data very well, we are putting together that data well, and that data is informing the type of decisions that we make that impacts learning outcomes. We are collaborating with the Teacher Workforce Initiative with the support of DFID to look into how our workforce can be the best, it can be agile, and it can be strengthened in terms of our manpower needs for the Ghana Education Service. Then we're also collaborating with the IEPA, or the Institute for Educational Planning and Administration at the University of Cape Coast, to establish a school leadership and management training. It's almost like a master's degree program where we are taking all of our school leaders over a period of time and taking them through a school leadership and management training. And eventually what we are hoping to do is that within Ghana Education Service, we're going to have a two-track approach. So if you enter the service after a number of years, you can choose the management track. And so if you want to head a school, you must have certain qualifications before you can head a school, rather than you've been the best literature teacher for 25 years, and so you're given a school to head. So now you choose a management track, or you choose a teaching track, and within the teaching track, you can go on to become a master teacher. But each of the tracks require a certain set of skills and competencies, and those are some of the things that we are doing. Then the final thing we'll talk about is high aspirations. What does that mean? I already mentioned this, that as a country, we are looking at a free universal basic education as redefined to include a senior high school. The idea of no child left behind, no pun intended. And then what we are doing is that we still had a challenge with either dropped out kids or out of school kids. And so we are using the complementary basic education to rope in pupils who have never either been to school or have been out of school as a way to get them back into the formal education space. And then one of our big agencies within the Ministry of Education, which is the National Inspectorates Board, we are really looking at the establishment of systems for school inspections that includes effective school leadership, teaching and learning to ensure that there is improved learning outcomes. And the National Inspectorates Board is leading that effort. How has that been done? We have done that through the inspections framework that has been introduced since March of this year. And then also our circuit supervisors are being trained to I think your mic is back.
Is it back? Yeah, very good. So, Kwabena, you've given us an overview of a very, very ambitious set of reforms. And it's not the first reform cycle for Ghana.
Yes.
And I wonder, I mean, you're looking at, is he okay? Yeah. You're looking at this reform cycle with fresh eyes as a new, young senior official in the ministry. When you look backwards at previous reforms, what lessons do you think Ghana can learn from how to ensure that these quality improvements that you have structured so carefully at the national level and in your national plan actually reach children in individual schools?
I think that's a very good question. And I will start with a quote that Deputy Minister of Education, Dr. Yawse Duchum, always says, that when he was doing his PhD, he had a professor who used to tell him that the road to hell in Africa is paved with great policies. You know, and so the detail is in the implementation. And what we have learned from the challenges of the past is that we need to pay a lot more attention to how we undertake the implementation process, and that we focus a lot more or equal attention to the implementation as we focus on the development of the policies. And so what are the things that we need to put in place to ensure that the goals that we have set for ourselves, that we are able to measure them, and we measure them at varying stages to make sure that we are on track, and where we are not on track, how do we course correct? So we have learned from the past that what we need to do is to look at how well we implement, and for that matter, how well we also monitor and evaluate the policies that we have put in place.
So I want to then ask a question about how are you going to know and iterate when you face challenges, or when your plans don't go according to plan, which is, I think, inevitable in any human system. And I think some of you have participated in a seminar on deliverology earlier this week, and there's been a lot of conversation about delivery approaches in Ghana, and I think the country has actually implemented a delivery approach as early as 2002 with funding from the UK. Now you're going into a second cycle of using a sort of delivery approach. Can you tell us a little bit about that delivery approach, and also sort of from the perspective of somebody inside the education service, what do you think of it as a format for this adaptive learning?
Well, what you're talking about is what is called the Reform Secretariat that we have set up within the Ministry of Education to ensure that we deliver on the reforms or the ambitious reforms that we have put forward, being supported by DFID with the Reform Secretariat. The approach really allows us to be able to track very well, because you have a set of matrix, and it also helps us to focus on the key things, on the key reform areas. And so right now we are looking at about 8 or 9 key reform areas, and therefore 8 or 9 key reform owners. And those owners, of course, the biggest reform owner is the Ghana Education Service. So it's quite an exciting approach, and I believe that it is a strengthening of the monitoring and evaluation division or the directorate that we have within the ministry, and then also within the Ghana Education Service. And the idea of the Reform Secretariat in terms of delivery is to support us in the area of even finding us technical assistance where we need it to be able to deliver on certain areas, helping us to meet quarterly standards. And the Reform Secretariat also organizes what we call in Ghana the accounting to the minister on a quarterly basis. And so we begin with a contract that all of the reform owners sign with the Minister of Education, where you have certain KPIs, and then you have certain indicators under each of the KPIs. And then those indicators are in quarterly benchmarks. And so at every quarter, we organize an accounting to the minister, which is a public affair, where you go to present where you are in terms of your benchmarks. Are you going to be able to meet your targets? Are you not going to be able to meet those targets? And the Reform Secretariat is supposed to help us and support us in all those areas to deliver on the targets that we have set. So I think it's an interesting and exciting setup.
So do you have any KPIs that you're personally responsible for, or your unit is personally responsible for within this results secretariat and set of results areas?
Yes. Ghana Education Service for 2019, we have 5 KPIs that we are responsible for. Of course, personally, we support our Director General because he's the reform owner. And so all of us support him in meeting those KPIs. The first 2 KPIs, no surprise, is around restructuring of our HR systems to make sure that we have a smooth running institution. And so we are looking at everything from looking at re-examining our job descriptions within it. Does it even make sense? Do the roles make sense? Do we need to restructure the roles? And then 3rd, 4th, and 5th KPIs are all to do with learning outcomes. So I guess you can say that those are areas that I'm directly responsible for. looking at learning outcomes or the indicators, the leading indicators that result in good learning outcomes in terms of teacher absenteeism, student absenteeism, reading, measuring the percentage of students who are reading at different levels. So those are things, and then designing academic intervention programs within all of our schools to ensure that there is quality and learning outcomes. So yes, we do have.
So when you wake up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat,
Learning outcomes. Because and it's even reflected in a new project that we are trying to put together in Ghana, where we're calling it the Gallop, which is the Ghana Accountability for Learning Outcomes Program. So it's rainy season or rainy season when families pull their children out of school. What strategies can we put in place to ensure that we have more students staying in school so that teaching and learning can occur? Okay, so that's my biggest.
That's your concern.
Yes.
I think I can give you some small comfort. I was sharing with Kwabena that I was in Ghana in October, and I spent a day at UCC with teachers in training. I thought they were remarkable in the kinds of questions they asked me about what good teaching looks like. So I think you have a fine crop of new teachers to harness into this problem.
Well, thank you.
I want to ask one final question, then I'm going to open up to the audience. I look at the future now to 2050, and I look at that demographic that you showed us. So such a large proportion of your population under 14 or under 15. And it seems to me that there are really two competing pressures for expansion in the system. One is, what are you going to do about skills and youth? The majority of youth are projected to remain in the non-formal sector, and it strikes me that secondary education in Ghana isn't very well suited to training students with the kind of skill they need to be effective entrepreneurs in this informal sector. So that's on the one side. And then on the other side, early childhood education. You didn't mention it here, but it is part of your sector plan. And if you have $1, how many of those dollars are you spending in pre-primary? What are your plans in that area? And then how are you going to tackle this youth skills problem, which is a very complicated problem. It's not only about STEM, it's also about how do you create this workforce of 2050 that is really going to have to be very entrepreneurial and is unlikely to be in the formal sector. Tell me a bit about that.
Good question. In terms of I guess the easiest of the two is the pre-primary or preschool or early childhood education. It's very obvious that the government is investing a lot of time in early childhood education and a lot of money, for that matter, in early childhood education. We are in the form of infrastructure, and so we are building a lot of new KGs, but in the form of the quality of teachers that are also teaching in the early childhood education, because there had been this phenomenon where the worst teachers teach in our KGs and primary schools, or I shouldn't say the worst teachers, but the teachers who don't have the best qualifications teach in our KGs and primaries, and then the teachers with the degree programs are teaching in our junior and senior high schools. And with our reform, where we are now saying that every teacher from our KG level to a senior high school must at least have a bachelor's degree, it's one of the investment, and that also forces good teachers to say that I want to go and teach at the early childhood level because I'm going to be paid the same type of salary, and so it no longer matters where you are teaching if you have the right kind of degree. So those are some of the investments that we are making. Of course, the investments that we are making in terms of ensuring that literacy and numeracy are solid at the early childhood education level is also a point to note in terms of the investment. Then you look at our young population. We still have a very young population. And the government is focusing the other side of its attention on technical and vocational education and training, both within our high schools as well as with what we call CODVET, or the Council on Technical and Vocational Education and Training. And even if you look in our ESP, or Education Strategic Plan for 2018 to 2030, we intend to triple the size of enrollments in our technical and vocational education and training, provide a lot more training in terms of entrepreneurial skills, and train people who can get out and create their own jobs. A lot of certification programs that are being put in place to ensure that people can have quick certificates to go into the workforce and then to be able to work. In a lot of our TVET institutions, we are now also developing curriculums to include entrepreneurship as part of their education, so that once you complete your technical and vocational education and training, you have some entrepreneurial skills and you're able to get out there and then do some work. Outside of that, which is not really directly related to the Ministry of Education, what the government is doing is the NABCO, which is the Nation Builders Corps, where we are taking the young people right now. The government has engaged about 100,000 people through a 3-year professional training program, where they are placed in different sectors of the economy. And they spend 3 years, but as part of their 3 years of professional training, so that they can have some skills on their sets to put on their CV, they are also given some training. 6 weeks every year is set aside to give them some professional skills and training in a formal setting. So those are some of the things that we are doing.
Before we turn to the audience, I asked you just briefly before we got on stage, I was telling you a little bit about some of the challenges I found in moving between sort of an academic role and into more of a practitioner role. And I said the hardest thing I found was politics. Politics always matters, but as academics, we have very little training. And some people have a natural skill. I personally do not. I do not have a poker face, for example. But I wondered whether what you found in this new leadership role to be sort of the leadership challenges that you face as a young administrator.
I guess it's a two-pronged answer. When I was teaching at St. Louis Community College, I taught a course on politics and policy. And so how do you marry the two? And of course, that was more from a purely academic setting, and it doesn't really translate when you
you think
when you enter this space. But I will say that I also when I spent some time in the United States. I spent about 15 years living here, so I'm a bit Americanized as well. But the formative years of my life, I lived with my high school teacher, who is also a politician. He was a Connecticut state senator. And so I picked up a lot from him in terms of how do you navigate the political space. While it may not directly translate to Ghana, it gave me some nuggets in terms of my work in Ghana. Luckily for me, when I went to Ghana, before I came fully into the government or public schools, I worked in a public-private school setting with Anglo Gold Ashanti, where our basic schools up to primary 6 were private, and then our junior high schools were public with public teachers. And so I learned to understand the dynamics and the delicacy of the relationship with public school and the public environment and politics. So those helped me, but it's still trial by fire, and I've been burned a few times, but I don't have any scars to show on that front.
Thank you. So I'll open up to the audience, and I think there's a couple of people with mics. I'll start on this side for a change. So we'll take 3 questions to start with. Luis, your hand went up before anybody else's. Is there anybody else?
I don't think that's true, but there was a hand over there. But
1, 2.
I'll go ahead.
Okay.
So I have a question that might seem kind of trivial, but has a broader implication in terms of some of the discussion earlier on about the South African curriculum and what I considered was a profoundly mistaken curricular reform in South Africa. And that is, you made a very interesting comment that, again, seems small, but I think it's actually huge. When you said we reintroduced history into the curriculum, as a standalone subject. I think you said something along those lines.
Yes.
And so my question is, what was the change? Had it previously been eliminated, or had, in a prior curricular reform, I assume, had the assumption been made that history is something that you can teach by, quote, integrating it into other subjects and so on and so forth. And then you discovered, hey, that was actually a bad idea. We need to actually have subject-oriented, at least for some subjects, a subject orientation in the curriculum. So that's my question.
Should we take another one, or do you want to answer that one? Okay.
We can take a few questions.
Hi, my name is Katie Malouf Boos with Oxfam International. And first, I want to congratulate you on the Ghana Free Senior High School program, which I think many of us have been excited to see as a reform that promotes equity. I'm curious, what are the challenges you're seeing in implementation of that program, and how are you addressing those? And then second, there's been much talk about a proposed public-private partnership at primary level in Ghana. My civil society colleagues have been quite concerned there. Can you give us an update on what the status of that reform is? Thank you.
That sounds like three questions there, so I think we'll let you go ahead with those three.
I'll take the PPP one first, so that we can address that. In terms of the update, what I would say is that we've pulled the handbrakes on it, so that we can go back to more engagement with teacher unions, more engagement with more stakeholders, to be able to understand the best strategy moving forward. And so, in the short term, you're not going to see anything in terms of a rollout, but it is still something that we are examining in terms of what are some of the best practices. Does it mean that those best practices will have to mean private actors, or the best practices will have to mean borrowing from what private sector is doing to implement? And so we're going back to more engagements. Of course, we are ensuring that moving forward, we are in lock and step with, especially with our teacher unions, to make sure that there is an understanding and we have a mutual understanding on the way to move forward. So the handbrakes are pulled, engine is turned off, and we are revisiting that. The Free Senior High School program, what I would say our biggest challenges, and actually there was an article on it recently in the New York Times, our biggest challenge has been infrastructure and being able to provide enough infrastructure for our students who are hugely excited about the Free Senior High School. We have seen almost a 20% growth in terms of enrollment rates when the Free Senior High School was introduced in 2017. And all of a sudden, we had more people knocking at the doors than we had seats available in the school. So we needed to borrow from an age-old strategy, which in other parts of the world, it's called the year-round school system. And so creating multiple tracks of schools within the same school. And that's what I would say, that's one of our challenges, and what we have done to address that challenge is to introduce a multi-track system, and in Ghana we're calling it a double-track system. And we had to adjust it because in Ghana 60% of our secondary schools are boarding schools. So you couldn't do the typical year-round system where kids go to school for 3 weeks, stay home for 1 week or 10 days and go back to school. We needed to create a different academic calendar that ensured that students were in school for a meaningful amount of time, and then they take breaks. So we actually moved away from a trimester system to a semester system to allow us room to create a double track in our first year students, when the second and third year students are still doing their trimester system. So it's quite an interesting solution that we've tried to put in place. It meant we had to hire more teachers because you can't bring in more students and overburden your existing teachers. So it meant we had to hire more teachers. We needed to hire more hands in the school, support staff, to make sure that happens. Your assumption is absolutely right in terms of the curriculum and history as a standalone. What had happened is that the teaching of history had been integrated into especially social studies. And what we started to realize was that it was being pushed to the back burner because it's kind of like, oh, everybody knows about Ghana. And so history was really not being taught formally, but it was integrated and it was beginning to die off. You meet Ghanaians on the street and you ask them very simple questions about 30 and 35 years ago, and it was a big challenge. And so it needed to be reintroduced, also as a way to build up patriotism among the young people and for them to really understand where we are coming from. It has not come with its own controversy and challenges, but just like any other place, we've been able to address them. But that is what happened, that we needed to reintroduce it as a standalone.
We'll go Bidemi and then here and then to
Hi, my name is Bidemi from RTI. I wanted to come back maybe a little bit to the topic of the presentation, which was about prioritization and hard choices. It still seemed to me that it's still quite a long list of things that you're doing. And I was wondering whether you could talk specifically about what things you had to say no to, and what were the reactions from maybe constituencies for whom that was sort of an issue for them. Can I ask 2 questions?
No. Sorry, but that was a very hard question, Bidemi, so please.
Hi, my name is Saida Farva Fatima. I'm a doctoral student at University of Pennsylvania. So I'm doing some research looking at professional well-being of new teachers in rural Ghana. And I've been finding some interesting results about how they face a set of risks, especially during their transition from their student teaching year right after they get out of college, part of the pre-service education, and when they transition to full-time teaching positions, especially in the first and second years of teaching. So I'm wondering if there are any, as part of the reforms you were talking about, if there are any reforms that are specifically targeted at the deployment systems that are in place for new teachers, and if you could speak to that. Thank you.
One more.
Hi, Nick Bull from South Africa. I also had a question about the prioritization and focus, the comment earlier from RTI. You mentioned foundation skills, early reading, early numeracy, the focus on foundation skills. And then you also mentioned tech and STEM and the digital revolution. And Karen, you did ask us to be provocative. So I went to go and look at the EGRA results of Ghana, as well as the TIMS results. And the 2015 EGRA results show that 50% of grade 2 Ghanaians don't know a single word in any language, including their home language. And that 79% of grade 8 students in TIMS can't calculate with whole numbers. So my question is, do you not think it's a big distraction to be focusing on this fourth industrial revolution and tech and teaching kids to code when they can't read?
Good question.
All right, you have 3 more tough ones this time.
All right, this time I'll take the middle one first. I'll take the middle one first. What we are doing is we have what we call teacher rationalization. Within Ghana right now, and just like a lot of developing nations, most people don't like to go to the rural areas to teach because of the lack of amenities, the lack of simple things as public transportation, electricity, water, or clean water. So we have a lot of challenges in that area. What we are doing, though, is that we have now introduced, right after pre-service, a national service component for all teachers, as well as every other student who is leaving the universities. And in national service, it provides an opportunity for that teacher to hopefully experience the possibility of being in a rural area, what some of those challenges are before they come into Ghana Education Service for placement. One other thing we're also doing is that once a teacher serves in a particular area for 3 years, they are eligible for transfer or reposting into other areas. And so those are some of the things that we're putting in place. But at the same time, we don't want a situation that we have our urban centers overpopulated with teachers, and then our rural centers, we have some challenges there. Within GES, we are looking at teacher rationalization as a way to address it. But overall, as a country, one of the ways that this is going to be addressed is when we go to decentralization, just like a lot of other countries are doing. But we are also discussing the idea of decentralization, not just in education, but in administration of the country. Once we move to decentralization, and education is the responsibility of the district, municipal, or metropolitan assemblies, then at that point, if I'm in Accra Metro, and I only have 22,000 positions available, I can only hire 22,000 teachers. And it's not the Ghana Education Service hiring and all those teachers are coming to sit at Accra Metro. So what will happen is that the teachers will, looking for jobs, will migrate to the other areas that also need teachers. This will mean that, especially in terms of their well-being, those districts will have to do more to attract quality teaching. And so they would have to ensure that if it is infrastructure, housing for teachers that need to be available, some type of a transportation system that needs to be available, those things will that's where hopefully we'll begin to see innovation. Then as Ghana Education Service, we can begin to find ways to support the districts that are still having challenges in terms of either attracting good quality teachers so that we can focus our attention on that. Then I'll come to the tech. Yes, it's a big challenge that a lot of the kids are not reading. I actually read somewhere that is it 92% of the kids can't read? You know, so your 50% was quite generous. You know, but what I would say is this: we have to be able to also prepare our students for the world out there. And so how are we leveraging that technology even to improve reading and mathematics? So it has to be a cross-cutting approach. So if you take, for example, what we are doing with Matific and what we are doing with Wiz Education, it is technology, but it is helping with numeracy, you know. And that is the same thing if we are looking at literacy. What are some of the approaches that we are using around Jolly Phonics and around other phonic approaches to ensure that the children are reading? And so if you look at some of the e-readers that we are introducing into our schools, it is leveraging technology to help our students read. But you cannot abandon the fact that when you release those kids out there, they must compete with a child from Helsinki. They're not going to be competing with a child next door. And so we need to be able to ensure that we give them that skill set in addition to the basics. The basics are very important, and that's why reading, writing, arithmetic, and creativity are foundational in terms of our curriculum. But we still need to be able to prepare them for the challenges ahead, and that's why we are marrying the two. We are trying to use technology to also support, you know, the foundational work. But it's very good in terms of the choices that we need to be able to make. I hope I've answered a bit adequately. And then all these priorities, what did we have to say no to? What if you look at it, we looked at 5 areas, right? We listed about 12 different things. And we felt those 5 areas can address those 12 things. There are still reforms that we are not going to address in either the first or second or third year. You know, but we expect that we will be able to address those reforms as the 5 key things that we have decided to focus on become solidified. But at the same time, you needed to be able to ensure that you can walk and chew gum, you know, and so all of those things, we felt if we can focus on these 5 things, you can begin to pull in all the other areas where there were challenges to anchor them.
Good. So I'll take questions now from this side of the room. One.
Hello, Dr. Tandoh. Thanks so much for subjecting yourself to this. My question is, I know in a previous reform, there was a shift to use of mother tongue or Ghanaian languages in the first few years of primary school. Can you say a little bit about whether that's going to continue or if you're shifting away from that?
Well, that's the big conversation around L1, L2, and we worked very closely with USAID in our learning project where we worked in 100 of our districts looking at the L1. We looked at 11 of the major languages in Ghana. We have more than 11 languages, but we picked 11 of the widespread languages, and we looked at L1 as a way to help kids to identify sounds, decode, and then to be able to blend sounds to make words. And then we knew that that then translates, especially when they begin to learn English. Moving forward, what we believe we want to do as a country is to adopt that phonics-based approach. And that's why we are adopting that from the USAID learning project, the phonics-based approach, and then Jolly Phonics. But the mode of instruction from KG is now English language. But the teaching of the mother tongue and the reading of the mother tongue is not out of the curriculum. It is now a subject rather than the mode of instruction from KG to primary 2, because then you still have a child that has to write an English exam, and then they have lost out on 4 years in terms of the English language. But we still know that the mother tongue is important because that's what is familiar with the child. And so we still take what learning is doing, and we ensure that that is happening, 1 or 2 periods a day, rather than throughout the entire day. And then we adopt the phonics-based approach in that, and then look at, and even with that learning project, moving forward, how do we transition the students to English? And so they now have a strong understanding of decoding sounds and making words out of it. How do you transition it to English? But that's what's happening.
Are there questions in this part of the room? Yes, please.
Wanted to return to the prioritization. So you mentioned how you're a reform owner and you're going to be looking across multiple areas of those 12 priorities, I presume, as the Ghana Education Service. And one of your KPIs is learning outcomes. But presumably many of those reforms are targeting learning outcomes, if not all of them. So as you get information on learning outcomes, how are you going to know which of those reforms are successful or unsuccessful and prioritize between them as a reform owner?
What we are doing is we're collecting a lot of data, and a lot of reform owners are collecting a lot of data. And so what we are doing is, and we are using, especially in our schools, the fidelity of implementation that we have picked up from the learning project. And we are using technology, again, as a way to collect all of that data. And so NIB is collecting data. Ghana Education Service is collecting data. NTC is collecting data. Or NACA is collecting data. And all of that will feed into one system where it is able to give you certain dashboards that, of course, you can drill down to the classroom level, but it gives you an overview. And based on that, you begin to make certain decisions as to what is working, what is not working. And so the way it is going to be underpinned by how well we collect that data and then analyze it as a way of making our next step in terms of decisions that need to be made. How do we know which reform areas are not contributing to learning outcomes? I think that's a question that requires a little bit more thinking through. But we believe that the ones that we have picked, they have to work in sync in order to improve learning outcomes. And of course, at the end of the day, we are the ones with the students in our classrooms. So what we we take credit, and when we have to be whipped down too, we'll be the one that will be beaten. So we have to work with all the we have to work with all the reform owners to make sure that what they are doing, because what every reform owner is doing is really the leading indicators. And it is the assessments and the results that are going to give us the lagging indicators in terms of the outcomes. And so we have an interest as Ghana Education Service to ensure that all of the reform owners are doing what they have to do to support us in terms of improving learning outcomes amongst our students.
Great. Any other questions? Final questions? Yes, please.
I have one simple one. I was just interested listening to you that with all these big reforms going on, how much you as an individual sitting in that agency, it's all ideologically driven because you want to see reform, you seem like an enlightened kind of a person, or how much of it is really responsive to that you see the community wanting it and that there is some kind of political lobbying happening, that are parents at all doing that? So just to understand a bit of the community dynamics, how are they in Ghana right now?
Well, if you have been paying a bit of attention to the conversation in the newspapers in Ghana, our PTAs are very active. And so we have a lot of parental involvement, especially at the senior high school level. You know, and so we do see and hear from a lot of stakeholders in terms of outcomes. Even when the double track intervention was introduced, you know, there was a lot of conversation around, is it going to dilute quality? And so everybody is asking and pushing in terms of the learning outcomes. Now when results are released from the BCE or the WASI, which is the senior high school exam, there's a lot of interest amongst, you know, old students, amongst parents in terms of how are the schools doing, which schools are doing well. And as a response to that, what we are going to be introducing through the Ministry of Education is a league table. We're going to be introducing a league table so that everybody can see in terms of ranking schools by bands of 0 to 10, which schools are doing well and which schools are not doing well. Because in Ghana, we already have 3 categories of senior high schools. We have the A, B, and C category schools. And so what we're going to do is rank all schools, and then we're going to rank schools in categories. So even though you may be a band 8, but within category 1, you may be a band 2. So some healthy competition among the schools. And then there is a lot of community interest, especially around how their children are doing.
I wonder if I could amplify that question, because you focused very much on the part of the level of schooling where one actually anticipates there's going to be a lot of public voice. But what about at the sort of the learning in the early grades? What kind of civil society or parental engagement do you see there? And how are you going to use this new assessment system to actually engage parents in demanding better quality and holding you to account?
Well, to face the honest truth, especially at the basic level up to junior high school level, 35% of our student population are in private schools. And unfortunately, what tends to happen is that the parents who are either a little bit well-educated, who will be more interested in what is happening in the schools, are the ones who send their children to private schools. And so that's where they focus a lot more of their attention. Mm-hmm. What we are doing to ensure that there will be a lot more stakeholder engagement at the basic and junior high school, or the basic level, and here I'm using basic to mean primary and junior high school, is that as part of Gallup, we are introducing the SMCs, or school management committees, where the school management committee actually involves the parents a lot in the decision making, how the school decides on what they are going to focus their attention on, the school being able to report out to the community, and report out meaning the community they are in needs to know how they are performing academically, how their teachers are performing, all those things. So we are bringing in a lot more community-based school management committees as a way to solicit more interest from stakeholders. It is a project that we've started at a very small scale with JICA, and we are now at the point that we want to scale it to about 10 or 12,000 of our basic schools.
Thank you. So I think that our guest and our audience has very much earned our cocktails. I actually was sitting in the audience wondering how people would manage to stay, and then the cocktails were announced, and I understood what the incentive or part of the incentive might be to stay here into the early evening. Thank you very much for responding so frankly. We heard at the deliverology workshop that deliverology approach in Tanzania was fondly called by senior administrators better resign now. And I dearly hope for your sake that your deliverology approach is less draconian and certainly as effective as intended. You certainly demonstrated that you have the communication skills to get through.
For us, it's not about resigning because we see the Reform Secretariat more as a partner than as a police officer. So
Good.
That's the strategy. We don't want anybody to resign because we don't want to lose talent. So we'd rather see how best we work with the talent that we have. No, but people still have to answer when they are not doing well. They need to be able to answer. They need to be accountable, and they need to be accountable for either the student's performance and at all levels. So from the teacher all the way up to the Director General, we all need to be able to hold ourselves to account.
Good.
And,
Thank you.
And the Reform Secretariat is really there to help us do that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So please join me in thanking Dr. Tandoh. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.